The air in Ouagadougou crackled with electricity. Tens of thousands filled the streets, their chants rising like a thunderstorm that refused to be silenced. Traoré! Traoré! They roared, voices echoing off crumbling buildings, carried on dust and heat. In the center of the storm stood a young soldier, barely past 30, his beret tilted with quiet defiance. To the people, he wasn't just a man. He was a symbol, a break in the chains that had bound their nation for far too long. Across the world, foreign news anchors scrambled to define him. Some called him Africa's youngest leader. Others whispered the word radical, their tones laced with fear and contempt. But in the streets of Burkina Faso, none of that mattered. What mattered was the sense of dignity his presence gave back to a people who had been told for generations that their destiny was not theirs to choose. And so, the hook of history was cast. In a world dominated by old powers and tired voices, one soldier under 35 dared to defy them all. His rise wasn't written in think tanks or boardrooms. It was carved from dust, sweat, and the silent prayers of mothers who had buried too many sons in a war they never asked for. But this moment, this eruption of joy and defiance, didn't come without shadows. Behind the cheering faces were whispers of betrayal. In foreign embassies, phones buzzed with frantic instructions. In the polished halls of power, leaders plotted. This soldier had stepped into a dangerous game where coups and counter-coups were weapons, and loyalty was currency bought and sold. Every cheer on those streets was also a target painted on his back. Still, he stood firm, not with the arrogance of a tyrant, but with the calm certainty of someone who knew his people were with him. And yet, the question hung in the air, heavy and irresistible. How did it come to this? How did a young soldier, once nameless among the ranks, rise from the barracks to shake the very foundations of global power? Because what happened next would not only rewrite the destiny of Burkina Faso, it would ignite a fire across a continent long denied its voice. Before Ibrahim Traoré ever became a symbol of defiance, Burkina Faso was a nation bleeding from wounds both visible and hidden. For decades, its people had carried the weight of poverty like a stone on their backs. Farms withered in the relentless Sahel sun. Children walked miles for water that wasn't always clean, and families lived with the bitter knowledge that their sacrifices rarely reached the halls of power. The nation had endured coup after coup, each one promising renewal, each one dissolving into disappointment. Hope was a currency that had been devalued so many times. People learned to guard it like a secret. But the darkest wound of all came from the terror stalking the countryside. Armed groups seized villages, leaving trails of ashes and tears. Soldiers sent north to fight often returned in coffins, while others never returned at all. In Ouagadougou, the capital, leaders issued statements about unity and progress. Yet in the villages, where mothers buried their sons with their own hands, the words rang hollow. Ordinary Burkinabe were caught in a vice. On one side, the cruelty of extremists, and on the other, the indifference of those who claimed to govern them. Hovering above it all was the shadow of France. Long after colonial rule had supposedly ended, French troops, French corporations, and French policies still shaped Burkina Faso's destiny. Resources flowed out of the country, while dependency flowed in. Politicians who dared to resist too strongly often found themselves isolated, replaced, or worse. To many, independence felt like a flag with no meaning, a symbol raised each morning over a land still beholden to foreign masters. And so the villains came into focus. Corrupt politicians who built mansions in the capital, while soldiers went unpaid. Foreign backers who claimed to defend stability, while draining the nation's wealth. Complacent elites who toasted champagne at foreign embassies, while their countrymen fought for scraps. Together, they formed a system that thrived on despair, feeding on the people's exhaustion, gambling that no one would ever be bold enough to challenge it. But dignity has a way of fighting back when it is denied too long. Beneath the surface of Burkina Faso's despair, anger simmered. In marketplaces, in classrooms, in the hushed conversations of weary soldiers, the question grew louder. How much longer? The people were tired of waiting for saviors who never came. They were tired of leaders who bowed more quickly to Paris than to their own citizens. They were tired of burying their children in silence. This was a tinderbox into which Ibrahim Traoré would step, a young soldier shaped by discipline, tested by hardship, and unafraid to speak aloud what others only whispered. He was not yet the face on the posters, not yet the name in the chants, but history was setting the stage, because in the chaos of betrayal and broken promises, a soldier would emerge, and his arrival would not simply mark another chapter in Burkina Faso's turbulent history. It would become a story of dignity reclaimed and a warning to every power, inside Africa and beyond, that the age of submission was breaking. To understand why Ibrahim Traoré's rise electrified his people, one must first look into the shadows cast by those who came before him. The villains of the story, both foreign and domestic. For years, Burkina Faso had been ruled by men who wore the mask of patriotism, but bowed their heads in quiet obedience to powers far beyond their borders. In public speeches, they thundered about sovereignty and independence. They stood at podiums draped in national flags and spoke of sacrifice, struggle, and the spirit of the revolution. But once the cameras were off, their loyalty shifted. Behind closed doors in European embassies, they negotiated away the nation's dignity in exchange for loans, contracts, and political survival. French corporations extracted gold and resources from Burkina's soil, while the International Monetary Fund imposed austerity measures that left ordinary citizens gasping for air. The politicians assured the people these were necessary partnerships. Yet the only thing ordinary Burkinabés saw was poverty deepening, while the elite grew fat. The hypocrisy was staggering. These leaders promised security but sent underpaid, under-equipped soldiers to fight terrorists in the north. Brave young men were handed rusty rifles and a few rounds of ammunition to face enemies armed with modern weapons and foreign funding. Villages burned, children fled into the bush, and survivors spoke of horrors that no one in the capital seemed eager to confront. Meanwhile, the same politicians who claimed to share the people's pain were chauffeured through Ouagadougou in luxury SUVs, escorted by bodyguards whose salaries dwarfed those of frontline soldiers. At night, while soldiers slept on dirt floors in makeshift camps, ministers and their families dined beneath chandeliers. Imported wine flowed, foreign bank accounts swelled, and the children of the ruling class studied abroad, far from the dust and blood of Burkina Faso. The contrast was obscene, a nation at war with itself, led by men who treated leadership not as a burden of duty, but as a ticket to personal enrichment. France's shadow only darkened this picture. French military bases dotted the land, justified as partnerships for security. Yet time and again, terrorist attacks grew bolder, villages kept falling, and ordinary Burkinabe began to ask a forbidden question. Whose security are they really here to protect? The suspicion was poisonous, that the presence of foreign troops wasn't solving crisis, but prolonging it, ensuring dependency, ensuring control. The politicians in Ouagadougou ignored those whispers. They believed the people's anger could be contained with promises and propaganda. They clung to power with the arrogance of men who thought themselves untouchable. They underestimated the growing resentment in the markets, the schools, the barracks. They dismissed the fiery speeches of young activists, the protests swelling in the streets, the soldiers muttering in their camps. They thought despair would keep the people quiet, that fear would keep them obedient. But every coffin returning from the north told a different story. Every mother who buried her son spread her grief like wildfire through her community. Every empty promise delivered from the capital deepened the divide between rulers and ruled. What the elites failed to see was that the more they feasted, the more the nation starved, not only of bread, but of hope. It was not one act of corruption or one failed policy that doomed them. It was the accumulation of betrayals, year after year, that hollowed out their legitimacy. And as the tide of anger rose, they clung ever tighter to their foreign backers, hoping the weight of France, the IMF, and international approval would shield them. But it was a brittle shield, one that could not withstand the fury of a people who had nothing left to lose. They thought the people's anger could be contained. They were wrong, because in the cracks of their crumbling empire, a new figure was rising, a soldier who would expose their hypocrisy not with speeches and palaces, but with action born from a barracks. And his defiance would shatter the illusion that Burkina Faso's destiny could ever again be dictated by the few at the expense of the many. Ibrahim Traoré did not begin his journey with power in his sights. He was not born into privilege or political legacy. His childhood, like that of so many Burkinabe, was shaped by modesty and struggle. He grew up in a land where children often walked barefoot to school, where families measured wealth not in money, but in resilience. His story was one of simplicity, a boy molded by the dust, the heat, and the unshakable spirit of survival that defines life in the Sahel. From a young age, Traoré's sense of duty was clear. While others dreamed of escaping the weight of their country's hardships, he chose to stand within it. The military called to him, not because of glory, but because it was one of the few paths where service and sacrifice still meant something tangible. He donned the uniform with humility, not ambition, carrying with him the quiet determination to defend the soil that had raised him. In the barracks, he earned respect the old-fashioned way, through grit, discipline, and consistency. He wasn't the loudest voice or the most decorated soldier, but when exhaustion crushed others, he kept going. When morale dipped, he steadied his comrades. When danger called, he answered without hesitation. This was not the brash courage of a man seeking recognition. It was the steady loyalty of one who understood that his strength belonged to something greater than himself. Stories about his character traveled quietly among soldiers. They spoke of how he would share his rations with those who had none, of how he volunteered for grueling assignments others avoided, of how he never pulled rank to belittle but instead to protect. In a military often burdened by hierarchy and fear, Traoré's leadership was marked by respect rather than intimidation. His comrades saw in him not just an officer, but a brother, someone who carried their burdens as if they were his own. What made him different was not ambition, but his refusal to surrender to despair. Many soldiers grew bitter, watching their sacrifices wasted by politicians in Ouagadougou. They fought in the north, watching friends fall, knowing their leaders were dining under chandeliers. Anger corroded the ranks, yet Traoré remained steady. His loyalty was not to the politicians who signed orders from afar, but to the soil beneath his boots and the people whose voices were silenced by war. Off the battlefield, his life remained marked by simplicity. He was not seen in luxury villas or foreign resorts. He lived as a soldier lives, modest quarters, modest meals, modest means. There are no extravagant displays, no hunger for cameras or accolades. He belonged to a generation of Africans who carried a quiet pride in living authentically, rejecting the trappings of elites who lost touch with their people. And yet, this humility only made his emergence more extraordinary, because Traoré was not an ambitious politician plotting in secret rooms. He was not a career schemer, weaving alliances with embassies. He was, in truth, a reluctant leader, a man who would never have chosen power for himself if history had not demanded it. The turning point came not through calculated ambition, but through the weight of circumstance. As terrorism consumed villages, as corruption hollowed a nation, as France's shadow lengthened, his people cried out for salvation. Soldiers looked for direction. Citizens longed for dignity. And in this vacuum of courage, all eyes turned to a young captain who had never sought their gaze. To understand Traoré's rise is to understand that sometimes history does not ask permission. Sometimes it seizes a man by the shoulders and thrusts him forward, not because he desires it, but because he embodies what the moment requires. For Burkina Faso, that man was Ibrahim Traoré. Still, for all his grit and all his loyalty, nothing could have fully prepared him for what was to come, for the betrayals waiting in the shadows, for the plots whispered in embassy halls, for the crushing weight of a continent's hopes placed on his shoulders. He had been shaped by simplicity and sacrifice, but destiny was about to test him in ways he could never have imagined. By October 2022, Ouagadougou was a city living on the edge of eruption. Days stretched under a tense, suffocating silence, broken only by sudden bursts of anger that spilled into the streets. Protesters gathered by the thousands, their chants rising like a drumbeat of defiance. Placards denounced the ruling elite. Flags waved defiantly, not as empty symbols, but as rallying cries for a sovereignty that had been stolen. The atmosphere was combustible, every breath laced with a feeling that something was about to break. The ruling government, corrupt, paralyzed, and clinging desperately to foreign lifelines, had already lost the people. Promises of reform and security had crumbled into dust. Villages still burned, soldiers still died, and France's presence loomed like an open wound. Every protester who marched was a voice screaming what millions felt. that Burkina Faso had been betrayed by its own leaders. But in the barracks, the tension was even sharper. Soldiers whispered in hushed tones, their loyalty torn in two directions. On one side was a government, issuing orders that demanded obedience but offered no honor. On the other side was a nation itself, crying out in anguish, begging for defenders who would finally listen. For men like Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the choice was agonizing. He had sworn an oath to serve, to obey, yet he had also sworn a deeper, unspoken oath to his people, to the mothers who sent their sons to fight, to the children who deserved a future free of fear. The government sensed the rumblings of dissent within its own military. In their arrogance, they believed fear could still be wielded like a weapon. Soldiers who questioned commands were threatened, silenced, or dismissed. Protest leaders were beaten, their voices dragged into jail cells where darkness swallowed their cries. The elites pushed harder, desperate to suffocate the growing storm. But every act of repression only fueled the fire. Foreign embassies watched nervously. The French, long accustomed to puppeteering the politics of Ouagadougou, sent warnings cloaked in the language of diplomacy. They urged stability, by which they meant submission. Yet even their carefully worded statements betrayed unease. They, too, could feel the tremors of something far greater than a protest. For Traoré, the pressure mounted daily. His comrades looked to him, quietly, searching for direction. He had never sought to be their leader. Yet his discipline, his loyalty, his courage made him impossible to ignore. Every funeral for a fallen soldier was another unspoken demand pressed into his hands. Every mother's tears seemed to ask him personally, how much longer must this go on? He knew the stakes. To act against the government would mean defying not only his superiors, but the global powers that shielded them. It would mean walking a path where failure carried a price not only for him, but for every soldier who dared stand beside him. Yet to remain silent was to betray everything he believed a soldier should be. The city's protests swelled to a fever pitch. Crowds surged through Ouagadougou, demanding an end to French dominance, demanding leaders who would fight for their people instead of bowing to outsiders. Flames licked the night sky as demonstrations grew bolder, angrier, louder. The ruling elite responded with arrogance, convinced that barricades and bullets would cow the people back into silence. They had no idea that their threats were only sharpening the resolve of those they sought to control. And in the midst of the storm stood Ibrahim Traoré, torn between loyalty and justice, between silence and action, between the soldier he had been and the leader he was being called to become. The night was thick with tension, the kind that makes the air feel heavy, charged, alive. Soldiers prepared quietly. Crowds gathered defiantly. Politicians feasted in their guarded villas, blind to the fury growing outside their gates. The night that would change Africa forever was about to begin. The city awoke to the sound of boots on asphalt and the low rumble of engines. In the dim light of dawn, Ouagadougou streets filled with soldiers, armored vehicles, and a silence so heavy it seemed to choke the air itself. Tanks rolled forward, not toward the people, but alongside them, as if escorting their cries of defiance. Crowds gathered at intersections, chanting with the rhythm of a heartbeat. Traoré, Traoré. It was not fear that spread that morning. It was something more dangerous for the ruling elite, unity. For the first time in years, soldiers refused to fire on their own people. Orders were given, shouted in desperation by commanders still loyal to the government. But the rifles did not rise. The fingers did not pull their triggers. Instead, the soldiers lowered their weapons and turned to stand shoulder to shoulder with the very crowds they were told to suppress. In that moment, the barrier between the army and the people shattered. The government's most trusted weapon, fear, was gone. Inside the presidential palace, panic unfolded. Ministers clung to phones, calling foreign embassies for assurances. They demanded intervention. They begged for protection. But the responses were vague, delayed, hedged in the language of monitoring the situation closely. The confidence of the elite, once so unshakable, began to fracture. They could hear the chants growing louder outside their walls. They could see that their own protectors no longer obeyed them. And then came the moment that would echo far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. From the back of a military truck, Ibrahim Traoré emerged. No grand stage, no polished podium, just a young soldier, beret tilted, eyes steady. He stood with the calm of a man who had already made peace with the risks ahead. His voice, when it broke through the crowd, was steady and unflinching. "My brothers, my sisters," he began, the crowd falling silent, straining to catch every word. "For too long, we have been told that our lives, our land, our future do not belong to us. For too long, we have watched our children die in wars we did not choose, while our leaders dine with those who profit from our suffering." His words cut through the heat and dust like a blade, each sentence tightening the crowd's grip on hope. He paused, scanning the faces before him. Soldiers, civilians, elders, children. His gaze was not the gaze of a politician, but of a soldier who had walked the same paths, felt the same hunger, buried the same comrades. "We stand here today," he continued, "not as slaves, not as beggars, not as a people to be commanded from Paris or Washington. We stand here, Burkina, free, proud, unafraid." And then came the line that would ripple across Africa, carried on social media, repeated in protests from Mali to Niger. "We will no longer be slaves in our own land." The eruption was instant. The crowd exploded in cheers, tears streaming down the faces of men hardened by years of disappointment, women who had buried their sons, children who had known nothing but fear. Soldiers pounded their rifles against their chests in solidarity. The chant rose like a tidal wave, sweeping through the streets, swelling into a roar that drowned out the last vestiges of doubt. Foreign observers, watching on television screens thousands of miles away, were stunned. Journalists scrambled to capture the words. Diplomats fumbled to rewrite their briefings. The phrase, "no longer slaves in our own land," was not just a declaration of defiance. It was an indictment of decades of neo-colonial control. It was a mic drop that could not be ignored. But in that moment of triumph, beneath the euphoria, there was also fear. Fear of retaliation from those who had just been defied. Fear of foreign interference, of sanctions, of sabotage. The people celebrated, but in the back of every mind lingered the question, how long would they be allowed to keep this victory? For Traoré himself, the weight was immense. He had spoken not just for himself, but for millions. His calm defiance had transformed him from a captain into the face of a revolution. Yet he knew the powers he had just challenged would not retreat quietly. The embassies would plot. The elites would scheme. The world powers would decide whether to punish or to tolerate him. Inside the palace, the villains felt their grip loosening. Their arrogance, once limitless, now cracked like glass under pressure. Some fled. Others bargained. Still others sat frozen in disbelief, unable to comprehend that the soldier they had dismissed as irrelevant had just ended their reign with a few sentences spoken from the back of a truck. The people, however, did not hesitate. They embraced the moment with unrestrained pride. For the first time in years, they felt dignity coursing through their veins. They sang, they danced, they wept. They looked upon Traoré not as a savior to worship, but as one of their own who had found the courage to say aloud what they had carried in their hearts. Yet beneath the jubilation, destiny whispered its warning. The coup was not the end. It was only the beginning. Ibrahim Traoré had claimed the stage, but holding it would require more than words. The forces arrayed against him, foreign powers, entrenched elites, hidden betrayers, were only just beginning to move their pieces. And so, as the chants thundered through the night and the world reeled from the shock, a new truth settled in. The people had found their voice, their fearless leader had spoken, and the palace walls trembled. But if Traoré thought the fight was over, he was about to learn the real battle had just begun. The morning after the coup, Burkina Faso was no longer just a country in West Africa. It was the epicenter of a storm shaking the world. On every street corner, the chants of victory still lingered in the air. But the true explosion came not in the streets. It came on the screens. Within hours, hashtags like hashtag Traoré, hashtag no more slaves, and hashtag Africa Rising trended across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Edits of Traoré's speech, stitched with booming music and slow-motion footage of soldiers standing firm beside civilians, went viral. A clip of him declaring, "We will no longer be slaves in our own land," racked up millions of views in a single night. Young African from Dakar to Johannesburg shared the words like an anthem. For them, this was not just a Burkinabe story. It was a mirror reflecting their own frustrations, their own hunger for dignity. On TikTok, teenagers in Lagos danced with rifles made of broomsticks, chanting Traoré's name. In Accra, murals appeared overnight, painting him as a modern-day warrior. Hashtags became battle cries, a digital uprising that foreign media could not contain. Every video, every meme, every post carried the same message. Africa was tired of bowing. The ripples spread quickly. In Mali, crowds poured into the streets, waving Burkinabe flags alongside their own. "Traoré is our brother," they shouted, seeing in him the same defiance that had fueled their own struggles against foreign influence. In Niger, protesters who had long fought against foreign troops erupted in joy, cheering not just for Burkina Faso, but for the idea that Africa could rise together. Even in Guinea, where political turbulence was already raw, young people saw in Traoré's defiance a flicker of possibility, that their fate too could be wrestled from the grip of old powers. For the first time in years, Africans were not watching history as spectators. They were participants. They were victors. Meanwhile, in the corridors of power outside Africa, panic brewed. Western diplomats gathered in emergency meetings, their language suddenly filled with urgency, stability, order, democratic process. But beneath the diplomatic phrasing was fear. Fear that the fire lit in Ouagadougou would spread across borders, undermining decades of carefully maintained control. Intelligence briefings painted Traoré as a dangerous radical. Some governments whispered about sanctions, others debated covert action. Mainstream media outlets followed suit, their headlines oscillating between shock and dismissal. Africa's youngest leader, or Africa's new strongman, asked one. Another warned of a radical shift threatening Western interests. The same outlets that had ignored Burkina Faso's poverty and bloodshed now couldn't stop talking about Traoré. Yet their framing was clear. He was to be painted as reckless, unstable, a danger to the very order they themselves had built. But the people saw through it. In the villages of Burkina Faso, farmers who had never touched a smartphone heard the echoes of the speech repeated like scripture. In the cities, students debated his words late into the night, not as a politician's speech, but as a declaration of war against humiliation. Across Africa, a generation that had grown up watching their leaders compromise and bow finally saw a leader who refused. In those first days, Traoré became more than a man. He became a symbol. He was young, unpolished, uncorrupted by the trappings of power. To many, that was his strength. He had not risen through the endless negotiations of elites, nor through the blessing of foreign capitals. He had risen from the barracks, from the soil of Burkina Faso itself. And that terrified the villains who had long profited from Africa's weakness. They scrambled behind closed doors, trading blame, whispering strategies. "We must contain this," they said. But outside those walls, it was already too late. For the first time in years, Africans saw themselves not as victims, but as victors. And in that realization lay a power more dangerous than any weapon: belief. But belief, as history has shown, can ignite revolutions, and revolutions always demand a price. The rise of Ibrahim Traoré was never just about one man. It was about a people who had been told, time and again, that their fate was to endure poverty, corruption, and foreign domination. It was about a continent scarred by centuries of exploitation, yet still daring to dream of dignity. His ascent was not the story of soldiers seizing power. It was a story of a generation standing tall and refusing to bow. For decades, Africa had been painted in headlines of despair. Hunger, war, instability, always as a victim, rarely as a victor. But Traoré's defiance cracked that narrative open. He reminded the world, and more importantly, his own people, that submission was not destiny. Dignity was not a luxury. It was a right. In his rise, the line between hero and villain was laid bare. On one side stood the exploiters, politicians who wore the mask of sovereignty while kneeling before foreign masters, corporations extracting wealth while leaving people in misery, and diplomats preaching democracy while propping up dictatorships. On the other side stood a young soldier, unshaken by their power, carried not by ambition, but by conviction. He became the voice of a truth long buried. Africa does not need permission to rise. The lesson of Traoré is larger than Burkina Faso. It speaks to every young African who has watched leaders steal their future, to every mother who has buried a child lost to violence, to every student who dreams of a continent respected rather than pitted. His story is proof that courage can be contagious, that when one stands unafraid, many will follow. But courage is not easy. It demands sacrifice. It invites danger. Traoré's journey was a reminder that fearless leaders are not born. They are forged in fire, in sacrifice, in the will of a people who refuse to bow. Every scar, every hardship, every betrayal became part of that forging. And when it came to clarity that true power does not rest in the hands of elites or foreign capitals. It rests in the unity of ordinary people who decide that enough is enough. This is why his rise matters. Not because it was a coup, not because it shook foreign embassies, but because it reignited a flame that had long been dimmed. A flame of self-respect, of sovereignty, of hope. And once lit, such a flame cannot be easily extinguished. For Africa's new generation, the message is clear. Submission is a choice, but so is courage. And when courage takes root, no empire, no corrupt elite, no foreign hand can hold it back. Traoré's story is unfinished, but the lesson is already eternal. The world may continue to label him radical, dangerous, unpredictable, but for millions, he represents something more powerful than labels. The possibility of a future where Africa's dignity is not negotiable. And so the story closes not with an ending, but with a challenge to believe, to stand, to refuse the chains of exploitation. Because the fearless leaders who will shape tomorrow's Africa are not waiting to be born. They are already here, being forged in the fire today. From the dust of Ouagadougou to the screens of millions, Ibrahim Traoré's story has traveled far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. It is no longer just a tale of a young soldier. It is a reminder that dignity is not granted, it is seized. That courage is not inherited, it is chosen. And that history bends not to the will of the powerful, but to the determination of those who refuse to bow. This is why his rise matters, not just for Africa, but for anyone, anywhere, who has ever been told they are too small to matter, too young to lead, too weak to stand. His defiance is not just Burkina Faso's victory. It is proof that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the human spirit can rise, unbroken. But here's the truth. Stories like this only live if we carry them forward. The same way Traoré's words lit a fire across a continent. You have the power to spread that fire, to let others know that courage is alive, that dignity is worth fighting for, that fearlessness is possible. So if this story moved you, if it stirred something inside you, don't let it fade when the video ends. Share it. Talk about it. Pass it on. Because the more we tell stories of courage, the more courage the world will see. And if you believe in this journey, in voices that challenge, in stories that inspire, then join us. Subscribe, be part of this movement, and help keep the fire burning. Because this is not the end. This is only the beginning.